Thank you for clicking on this screencast. The purpose of this information is to show the thinking behind the creation of a summative assessment that is aligned with a power standard. For the sake of brevity, this screencast will show the creation of a paper and pencil style test. However, the information shared would be equally valid in the creation of a performance assessment, project, or other form of summative assessment. The first step in the creation of an assessment linked to a power standard is to review the proficiency scale associated with that standard. If your selected power standard does not have a proficiency scale yet, please view the screencast on how to build one and develop that proficiency scale first before moving on to the summative assessment design. Make sure to use the updated proficiency scale template for all scales. Here is a link to the new template for the proficiency scales at College Community School District. Once your proficiency scale is built, you can begin developing your assessment. All summative assessments must give students the opportunity to show their understanding of the power standard at the approaching, meeting, and exemplary levels. You can design your assessment in any way you choose. Some examples of this could include a leveled assessment where approaching questions are asked first, then meeting questions, and ending with exemplary level questions. You could also mix the levels so that students will encounter different levels as they progress through the assessment. Or you could write multi-level questions where students can show their understanding at 2 or all 3 levels within the same question. It is up to the teacher to determine what format is best for their students. For this example, we will be creating a leveled assessment where students progress from one level to the next as they make their way through the test. We will start off with the approaching level. The first thing we want to do is look at our proficiency scale to determine what type of question we could be asking. The power standard we are using for this assessment is SS 9-12.H.8. Understand cause and effect relationships and other historical thinking skills in order to interpret events and issues. As we examine what is written at the approaching level on the proficiency scale, we see that the approaching level is a partial demonstration of skills and/or content at the meeting level. On the right of the scale, we see what the students will need to be able to do in order to qualify their work at the approaching level of proficiency. When we think about questions we could ask students at this level, they should reflect this partial level of skill and/or content. In the test we are building for this screencast, we could create a question like this one. In this question, it asks students to engage with all 3 partial demonstration skills necessary to be able to show proficiency with a power standard at the approaching level. First, students are asked to determine a historical question about why something happened. In our question, students will have to think about what impact did the 14th Amendment have on U.S. history. Second, students will need to be able to identify historical events associated with the historical question. Students will need to be able to think about the Civil War, which happened before the passage of the 14th Amendment, and Reconstruction, the period in which the 14th Amendment was passed. It will also be necessary for students to have a broad understanding of what America was like during these 2 periods of history. Finally, students will have to understand the chronological relationship between the identified historical events. Students will have to know that the Civil War came before Reconstruction. If a student can do these 3 things, then they should be able to answer the question and show how they have at least an approaching level of proficiency towards the power standard on this assessment. After I have built my approaching level questions, we are ready to build the meeting level questions, which allow the student to show whether or not they are proficient with this particular standard. Meeting level questions will require students to show that they have an understanding of the approaching level material in order to show proficiency with the power standard. When we look at the meeting level or proficiency scale, we see the whole power standard on the left-hand side. To the right of the power standard, we see some examples of what students should be able to do in order to show proficiency with this power standard. When reading the descriptors of what a student will do, A teacher may decide that a multiple choice style question is not the most appropriate way to determine if a student has met the proficiency. Based on the descriptors in our example proficiency scale, the verbs used require us to have students explain their thinking. Therefore, a written response would be most appropriate for this example. Here is an example of a political cartoon about the 1896 Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson. We want to see if students can show their understanding of cause and effect while at the same time using their interpretation of a political cartoon to guide their thinking. So we can ask a question such as this one. Examine the political cartoon on the right. Provide an analysis of its message as it relates to the outcome of Reconstruction policies on American society. Their response will require them to do all three of the descriptors listed on the proficiency scale. First, students will need to explain the relationship between or among historical events. In this question, students will need to explain how the period of Reconstruction and the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson are related to each other. Second, students will need to determine if this relationship is causal or coincidental. In this particular example, we would expect students to show, through evidence and reasoning, that the relationship is causal. Lastly, students will have to evaluate how the relationship helps interpret the past. Student responses should give an interpretation about how the failure of Reconstruction policies led to legal racial segregation in America. If a student can do these three things with this and other meeting level questions, then the teacher can be confident that they have shown proficiency with the power standard and assess them as such. The bulk of the questions on a level assessment should be at the meeting level. The test is designed to determine a student's proficiency with a power standard, so it reasons that they should have the most opportunities to show that understanding at the meeting level. However, you will also want to provide the opportunity for students to show that they have an exemplary understanding of the power standard. When we look at the exemplary level on our proficiency scale, we see examples of how a student could exhibit an exemplary understanding of the standard. Some possible examples of this exemplary level thinking could be: they may demonstrate a real-world application of the standard, use information to solve problems in a different context, explain the connection between ideas, demonstrate a new insight, or a creative application. The descriptor for what the student will do to show an exemplary level proficiency is that they will analyze how the cause and effect relationship identified in past historical events helps explain a current cause and effect relationship. What we notice is that the power standard has been slightly modified at the exemplary level. We are asking students to go beyond cause and effect as it relates to historical events and utilize that skill to help explain current cause and effect relationships within a historical context. While the power standard at the exemplary level is slightly different, the intent and spirit of it is still there. Should teachers determine that they will need to modify the power standard for the exemplary level, they should also strive to ensure the intent and spirit of the power standard remains. For our test, perhaps we want to determine whether our students can see how an historical event continues to impact the present day. We could write a question at the exemplary level such as this one. In this example, the question asks students to interpret a historical cause and effect relationship in Part A of their response. In Part B, they are then asked to use the relationship to help explain a current cause and effect relationship. This type of question requires students to show all three levels of proficiency in order to fully respond to it. Students have to demonstrate a good understanding of what happened in the past at the approaching level. Explain the cause and effect relationship between those historical events at the meaning level, and finally show a connection between the historical relationship and a current cause and effect relationship at the exemplary level. If a student is only available to accurately do Part A, then they would be marked at the meeting level for this question. However, if they were able to give some accurate connections between what they accurately wrote in Part A and then what they wrote in Part B, then this would qualify them for an exemplary level of proficiency on this question. In this type of tiered assessment, you will give separate questions for each level of the proficiency scale. This does not mean that students do not have to show an approaching level of proficiency when they respond to meeting or exemplary level questions. A well-crafted question at the meeting or exemplary level will link the lower levels together with it. This, of course, leads a teacher to reason whether they could only ask exemplary level questions and then determine where a student's response might be on a proficiency scale. There is no reason a teacher cannot do this as long as they can clearly identify the approaching and meeting level components a student will have to demonstrate in their response and that the question or questions asked clearly directs the students to do this. Granted, you are most likely not going to be giving a test over this particular power standard or topic. However, the thinking behind building an assessment that is tied to standards is the same. Your proficiency scale is the key to your assessment. If you cannot tie a question back to a level on your proficiency scale, then it should not be part of your summative assessment. In a standards-based grading world, we are only recording a student's understanding of a power standard, not other learning that may be associated with the class. We also must be very careful as to what level we assign a question to. For example, if the question asks only for partial demonstration of the power standard, it cannot be marked as a meeting or exemplary question. Thank you for your attention to this screencast. If you would like continued support in creating a standards-based summative assessment, I would encourage you to read through the Standards-Based Learning Handbook and review the Designing a Standards-Based Curriculum website. You can also reach out to your building instructional coach or one of the K-12 curriculum leads for your content area.